She dropped it into the trash can right in front of everyone, brushed her hands together like she was clearing away something dirty, and said, "It's just junk." Just like that, no hesitation, no flicker of shame. My son sat across the table and said nothing. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something irreversible has just been done out in the open. I looked at her. I looked at the trash can. Then I looked at my phone, where I had a folder full of confirmation emails for 12 days in the Amalfi Coast. Flights, hotels, boat excursions, a private villa dinner. Every single reservation paid for in full by me, under my name, attached to my email address. By 5 o'clock the next morning, every one of those reservations had been canceled, and every refund had been routed back to my account. The vacation they had been talking about for 4 months simply ceased to exist while they were still asleep. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a cruel woman. I did not do what I did out of spite, and I did not do it to punish anyone for not being grateful enough. I did it because I finally understood, after years of not understanding, that generosity without limits is not a virtue. It is an invitation. It tells the people around you that your time, your money, your care, and your effort have no cost. That they are simply available, like water from a tap, to be used however anyone sees fit. Once you allow that belief to settle in, it becomes very difficult to remove. The only way to remove it, I found, is to turn off the tap. My name is Margaret Elaine Forsyth. I am 64 years old. I am a widow. My husband, Robert, passed away 3 years ago after a short illness. And in the time since then, I have been learning, slowly and not always gracefully, how to be a person who belongs entirely to herself. On the morning that I am about to describe to you, I was approximately 3 weeks away from understanding that lesson completely. What happened at that dinner table finished my education. If any of this sounds familiar to you, if you have ever poured yourself into a relationship or a family and watched it taken for granted, if you have ever stood in a room and felt invisible despite everything you have given, I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story, because I think what happened next might mean something to you. And if you have been through something like it or something close to it, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments below. You are not alone in this, and neither was I, even when it felt that way. Come along. I live in a house that Robert and I built together over the course of about 20 years. Not built with our own hands, to be precise, but built in the way that people build a life. One decision at a time, one room addition, one paid-off loan, one small upgrade in a good year. The house sits on just under 2 acres in a quiet part of western Connecticut, with a porch that looks out over a stretch of old oak trees, and a kitchen that I designed myself with the specific intention of having enough counter space to actually cook in. Robert and I used to cook together on Sunday mornings. That detail is not important to the story, except that it explains why the kitchen mattered so much to me, and why what happened in it later mattered even more. When Robert died, I was 61. I had recently retired from a position as a compliance officer at a regional insurance company, which I had held for 19 years and which had provided, by the end, a very comfortable income. I had a pension. I had a 401k that Robert and I had been careful with. I had the house, which was paid off. I had, for the first time in my adult life, absolutely no one to answer to and absolutely no financial obligation pressing on me from any direction. The feeling was unfamiliar. It took months before it stopped feeling like something was wrong and started feeling like something was right. That autumn, 3 months after Robert's funeral, I began to reconstruct my days around small, deliberate pleasures. I had coffee on the porch every morning, regardless of temperature. I started reading again, real reading, not the 15 minutes before falling asleep that had been my habit during working years. I began taking long walks in the afternoon and occasionally meeting a friend for dinner on a weeknight just because I felt like it. My life had a quality of earned stillness to it. I do not want to paint it as perfect, because loneliness is real and grief is real, and there were evenings when the house felt very large. But the structure of my days was mine, and I'd come to treasure that. On the particular Tuesday that set all of this in motion, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey at 3:30 in the afternoon, going through a small stack of mail, when I heard a car in the driveway. I did not immediately recognize the sound as belonging to my son Daniel's vehicle, but When I looked through the window, I saw his dark blue SUV parked at an angle that suggested he had arrived in some urgency. He was not alone. His wife, Renata, was in the passenger seat. They had not called ahead. This was not unusual. It had not been unusual for approximately 2 years, which is how long Renata and Daniel had been married. In that time, I had developed a working understanding of the relationship's texture. Daniel was my son, 37 years old, a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, pleasant in most situations, and deeply constitutionally averse to conflict. He had been this way since childhood. He did not lie precisely, but he had a gift for not seeing things that were inconvenient to see, and an even greater gift for not mentioning them. Renata was 34, worked sporadically in what she described as brand consulting, and had a manner of speaking that combined complete confidence with a remarkably casual relationship with other people's feelings. She was not overtly cruel. She was something harder to argue with. She was simply certain. Certain that what she wanted was reasonable. Certain that what she received was deserved. Certain, apparently, that the people around her existed to make her comfort possible. The pattern between us had never been openly hostile. It had been the kind of pattern that hides in plain sight. Polite on the surface, extractive underneath, sustained entirely by my willingness to absorb costs without naming them. It had begun, as these things often do, with something small and well-intentioned. About a month after Daniel and Renata's wedding, they had come for a weekend visit, and Renata had mentioned, in the offhand way she had of mentioning things, that their apartment had a very small kitchen, and that she missed being able to cook properly. I had offered naturally to let her use mine whenever she liked. She thanked me warmly. 2 weekends later, she arrived without Daniel, with 2 bags of groceries and a friend I had never met, and spent 4 hours cooking an elaborate dinner that she served in my dining room to herself and her friend while I ate leftovers from the refrigerator in the kitchen. I did not say anything. I told myself I was being generous. That was the opening. What followed was a slow accumulation of similar transactions, each one a little larger than the last, each one made more comfortable by the fact that I had not objected to the one before. Renata began using my house not as a guest, but as an amenity. She came to use the washing machine when hers needed repair, and then continued coming long after the repair was made. She started directing the cleaning service I paid for, telling the woman I employed which rooms to prioritize and which products to use, without asking me, without mentioning it. She brought clothes and left them in the guest room closet. When I mentioned the closet gently, she told me the clothes were just a few things and changed the subject. Daniel observed all of this with the same serene non-awareness that I had come to recognize as his particular defense mechanism. When I raised things with him carefully, he would agree that Renata could be a lot sometimes, and then nothing would change. He was not defending her, exactly. He was simply declining to be inconvenienced by the situation. The thing that changed in my own life was the final payment on the house, which I made 14 months after Robert died. The moment the statement showed a zero balance, something shifted in me that I had not been expecting. Robert and I had carried that mortgage together for decades. It had been our shared obligation, our shared anchor. When the anchor lifted, I felt something clarify. The house was mine, in a way it had never quite been mine before. I had no partner to defer to, no institution to answer, no debt to justify my choices around. The house was simply mine, and what happened inside it was entirely my decision to make. I had not fully acted on that understanding yet, but it was there, waiting. Now here is where I return to that Tuesday afternoon, because the arrival I'm about to describe was the one that completed the circuit. Daniel came through the side door without knocking, which he had always done, and which had never bothered me until it did. Renata was a step behind him, and she was carrying a large tote bag that I recognized as belonging to her travel collection. She set it down on my kitchen island, looked around the room with the absent approval of someone inspecting a hotel, and said, "We need to talk about the anniversary trip." The anniversary in question was a family celebration. My parents had been married for 45 years before my father died, and the family, meaning myself, my sister Carol, and our respective children, had decided some months prior to mark the occasion by gathering together for a proper trip. It had been proposed as a group effort. But as the planning progressed and logistics required a credit card to be attached to reservations, it had been my card that everyone looked toward. Daniel and Renata had made it clear that their finances were complicated right now. Carol's son had a baby at home. It seemed natural. I was the one with the resources and the organizational clarity, so I became the one who paid. I had booked 12 days in Italy. I had spent weeks researching, comparing, emailing property managers, reading ferry schedules. I had prepared a comprehensive travel document with every confirmation number, every address, every local contact. It had cost me, in total, just under $22,000. No one had been asked to pay me back. The trip was my gift to the family. That same afternoon, before Daniel and Renata arrived, I had spent most of the morning finishing the other gift. Robert and I had owned a small collection of family photographs and documents. Letters, ceremony programs, old pictures in frames that had been stored in boxes for years. And I had spent the past several weeks working with a local bookbinder to create a proper commemorative album. It had hand-stitched leather covers, archival quality pages, and photographs I had individually scanned, restored where necessary, and arranged in chronological order with handwritten captions. There were also reproductions of 2 letters my parents had written to each other before their marriage. It had taken time that I cannot fully quantify and money that was secondary to me entirely. I had completed it 2 days before and placed it on the sideboard in the dining room, wrapped simply in brown craft paper. I showed it to Daniel and Renata that evening at dinner. The extended family was not yet present. That gathering was scheduled for the following Saturday, but Daniel and Renata had come for the week, and I had wanted Daniel in particular to see the album before the celebration, thinking he might have something to add or correct. I unwrapped it carefully and set it on the table between the plates. Renata glanced at it. She reached over and flipped through perhaps 4 pages. Then she stood up, carried it to the kitchen, and set it in the trash can next to the refrigerator. She returned to the table and sat down. "It's a bit old-fashioned," she said. "People don't really do photo albums anymore. We can just share everything on a family group chat. It'll be easier for everyone." Daniel looked at his plate. "It's just junk," she added, almost as an afterthought, as if she were clarifying a point she thought might have been ambiguous. I sat very still. I want to describe what I felt in that moment, because it was not what you might expect. I did not feel rage. I did not feel the particular hot shame of being humiliated in my own home. What I felt was something closer to a window opening. Very clear. Very cold. A sudden total transparency about the nature of what was in front of me. I had spent years managing this relationship carefully, finding the diplomatic path, calibrating my generosity so that it satisfied without encouraging too much. I had told myself that the way Renata treated me was a personality difference, a generational thing, a matter of her having grown up in a household where manners were different. I had told myself a great deal. In the space of about 4 seconds, while I looked at the trash can and then back at the table, all of those explanations went quiet. What remained was a single clear recognition. This was who she was. This was who she had always been. And this was who she would remain if I continued to make it comfortable for her to do so. I said, "Excuse me for a moment." I got up, retrieved the album from the trash can, and brought it to my bedroom. I placed it on the shelf above my desk. Then I came back to the table and finished dinner. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I sat in the kitchen for a long time with a glass of water and thought through what I was going to do. I did not make any decisions in anger. I made them in the same state of careful professional clarity that I had spent 19 years bringing to compliance work, identifying what the situation actually was rather than what I wished it were, and then determining the appropriate response. The first and most obvious decision concerned the trip. $22,000 is a significant sum of money. It is not money I cannot afford to lose, but it is money that came from my retirement savings, from decades of careful living, from choices Robert and I had made together about what mattered. I had given it freely, and I had meant to give it freely, but I had given it as a gift, as an expression of love for a family occasion that was meaningful to me. The person who had just dropped that gift, the other one, into a trash can and called it junk was the wife of my son, and my son had watched and said nothing, and this was not a new behavior. This was the behavior I had been absorbing for 2 years. The trip was 12 days in Italy. Renata had already begun telling her friends about the villa. She had sent me a list of dietary preferences for the private dinner, which I had forwarded to the restaurant without comment. I opened my laptop and navigated to the first booking platform. I have a systematic mind. I had organized all of the reservations in a single folder. I went through them in order, most expensive first. The villa, the flights, the boutique hotel in Positano, the boat excursion, the private villa dinner, the transfers, the day trip to Capri. Each cancellation took less than 3 minutes. Some had cancellation windows that resulted in partial refunds. Others were fully refundable within a 24-hour window that I was still inside. By 4:58 in the morning, I had recovered the majority of what I had spent, and the remaining loss was a number I was willing to accept as the cost of clarity. I did not immediately tell anyone. I went to bed as the sky began to lighten. I slept without difficulty. For anyone who has wondered about this, and I know some of you have because these questions come up whenever someone in my position talks about taking back what is theirs, there is something worth understanding about the legal and practical reality of a situation like this one. When you pay for something, when your name is on the reservation, when your card is attached to the booking, and your email address is on the confirmation, that reservation belongs to you. Not to the people who assumed they were going to benefit from it, not to the people who made plans around it, not to anyone who was merely told about it. You, the person who made and paid for the reservation. You have every right to cancel it, to change it, to redirect it, to let it lapse. You owe no one an explanation in advance. This is not about being unkind. This is about a simple, structural fact that tends to get obscured when families operate under long-standing informal arrangements. A gift that has not yet been given is not yet a gift. It is still yours. And you remain free to decide, at any point before delivery, whether to give it or not. I had decided. By the time Daniel and Renata came down for coffee on Wednesday morning, I had already been up for 3 hours, had taken my walk, and was sitting on the porch reading. I had prepared coffee and left it on the counter, as I always did. I was perfectly pleasant. I answered Renata's question about the weather with accurate information. I noted that the French press needed new grounds and pointed to where they were. I did not mention the trip. I let them have that morning. The kitchen, however, was the first place where they began to encounter the new reality, though I had not announced it as such. I had, the previous afternoon before the dinner, taken stock of what was in my refrigerator and my pantry, and made a quiet internal decision that I would no longer be resourcing this household for people who treated my home as a hotel and my effort as background noise. I did not clear out the kitchen dramatically. I simply stopped replenishing things at my own expense for general use. The coffee was there, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, some basic condiments. Beyond that, I had moved my personal groceries, the things I had bought specifically for my own meals, the ingredients I had planned to use for the week, into a small second refrigerator I kept in the mudroom, which I had not previously locked, but which I now locked with a simple combination latch. It took them until Thursday morning to notice when Renata opened the mudroom refrigerator and found it secured. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression I had not seen on her face before. It was not quite anger. It was more the look of someone who has reached for a light switch and found that the wall behind it is gone. "The mini fridge is locked," she said. "Yes," I said. "Those are my groceries for the week." She waited, apparently for an explanation or an apology or a reversal of the decision. I returned to my reading. I should be precise about what I left available. The coffee, the bread, the peanut butter, a dozen eggs, a carton of milk, a box of pasta, and jarred tomato sauce. This was not deprivation. This was a guest room supply level, appropriate for people who were staying in someone else's home and who might reasonably have been expected to contribute to or supplement their own food at any point during a week-long visit. They had not done this. Renata had, in fact, taken the last of my good olive oil the previous week for a salad dressing and had not replaced it, which was a small thing, and which I mention only because it was one of approximately 40 small things that I had been absorbing without comment for 2 years. What followed on Thursday and Friday was a low-grade reorganization of the household that I approached with the same methodical calm that I had brought to the refrigerator situation. The guest room, where Daniel and Renata were staying, had a bathroom that connected to the hallway, And that bathroom had been left, for the duration of their stay, in a state of occupancy that was beginning to extend itself. Renata's products had migrated to the hallway shelf, to the bathroom windowsill, and most recently to the small wicker basket on the vanity that I had specifically put there for my own items. I collected my items and moved them to the master bathroom. I then placed a simple hook lock on the interior of the hallway bathroom door, which could be locked from the inside during use, but could not be held open from the outside. I also removed the key from the guest room, which I had never done before, and began leaving the room key on the kitchen counter each morning so that Daniel and Renata could take it when they went out and return it when they came back. It was a hotel-style arrangement. I phrased it as practical because it was. Renata told Daniel about the key the same evening. Daniel came to find me in the living room, where I was finishing a letter I was writing to my sister, Carol, about the trip logistics, the revised logistics, which I would address in due course. He sat in the armchair across from me and arranged his face into the expression he had used since childhood when he needed to have a conversation he found unpleasant. "Mom," he said, "I think you might be making Renata feel unwelcome." I set my pen down and looked at him. I took a moment. "Daniel," I said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're telling me that the person who threw the album I spent 3 weeks making into the trash and called it junk feels unwelcome?" He shifted in the chair. "She didn't mean it like that." "What did she mean it like?" "She just... You know how she is. She says things without thinking." "I know how she is," I said. "Yes, I do." Silence. "The locks," he started, "are on my house," I said, "which is mine. You're welcome here, Daniel. You are always welcome here. But welcome is not the same as entitled to access every part of the house without question. Those are two different things." He tried several more angles. He suggested that I was being sensitive. He suggested that Renata had a particular way of expressing herself that came from her upbringing. He suggested that perhaps this wasn't the right week to be making changes to the household arrangements with the celebration coming up. I let him finish. Then I said something I had been thinking about for 3 days. "Daniel, I need you to understand something, and I need you to hear it fully rather than begin looking for the response before I've finished. This house is the only thing in my life that is entirely mine. Your father and I built it. I have paid for every tile and every window and every piece of insulation in the walls. I paid the last dollar of the mortgage 14 months ago, and I have not asked a single person for help in maintaining it since. What happens in this house is my decision, not Renata's, not yours, mine. You are welcome to be here because I love you. The terms of that welcome are mine to set. I am setting them." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to her." "You don't have to," I said. "She doesn't need to change the way she feels about it. She just needs to operate within the terms." He left shortly after that. I heard them talking in the guest room for a while. The walls in that part of the house are not thick, and I did not attempt to listen. I went to bed at 10 o'clock and slept well. The Saturday celebration arrived. Extended family came for the afternoon and evening. Carol and her husband, Daniel and Renata, Carol's son James and his wife with their infant, and 2 cousins who had driven up from New Jersey. It was a pleasant gathering, as gatherings go. The food was good. I had cooked most of it myself over 2 days, which I had done because I wanted to, not because anyone had asked. At some point in the afternoon, someone, I believe it was Carol's husband, Gary, asked about the Italy trip, wanting to confirm the dates. The room turned expectantly toward me. Renata, who was standing near the kitchen door with a glass of wine, looked up with a particular expression that I recognized as the one she used when she wanted to appear modest about something she was in fact very pleased about. "There's been a change in plans," I said. "The trip won't be happening." The room produced several reactions simultaneously. Gary looked confused. Carol looked at me carefully in the way that older sisters look at younger ones when they suspect something significant is being communicated below the surface. James looked disappointed. Renata's expression did something complex and quick that resolved itself into a neutral mass before it finished. "What happened?" Daniel asked. "I decided it wasn't the right arrangement," I said. I did not elaborate. I redirected the conversation toward the dessert I had prepared and the fact that Carol's granddaughter needed to be changed, and the moment dissolved. The evening continued pleasantly. What was not pleasant was the conversation that took place after the other guests had left around 9 o'clock, when it was once again just Daniel and Renata and myself in the house. Renata had found a glass of wine and stationed herself at the kitchen island with the manner of a person who had decided something. Daniel stood slightly to her left, which was his usual position. "I want to understand what happened to the trip," she said. Her voice was even. She had decided to be even about it, I could see. She had calculated that evenness would be more effective than anger. "I canceled the reservations," I said. "Why?" "Because it was my money and my decision." She looked at me for a moment. "We made plans," she said. "I told people." "I understand," I said. "I arranged my schedule. I requested time off." "I'm sorry that caused you inconvenience," I said. I meant it as a plain statement, not as an apology for the cancellation. "You're telling me you canceled $20,000 in reservations because of a photo album?" I considered how to respond to this. I looked at her for a moment. "I canceled the reservations because I reassessed the arrangement," I said. "The album was clarifying, but the assessment was about the arrangement." She opened her mouth and then closed it. Daniel said, "Mom, that's a pretty serious response." "Yes," I said. "I thought so too." That was the extent of the discussion that evening. Renata finished her wine in silence and went upstairs. Daniel lingered for a moment, looking at me with an expression that was difficult to categorize. It was somewhere between hurt and a grudging, uncomfortable recognition that he could not quite look away from. I had thought that would be the end of the immediate confrontation. It was not. The following Monday, I received a call from my brother-in-law, Gerald, Robert's younger brother, who lived in upstate New York and whom I saw perhaps twice a year at family occasions. Gerald was, in the broadest terms, a pleasant man. He had always been decent to me during Robert's life and had called twice after the funeral to check in. We were not close, but we were cordial. He called that Monday afternoon while I was in the garden. I answered, and we exchanged pleasantries for approximately 2 minutes, which was longer than our usual preamble, and which told me something was being worked up to. "Margaret," he said eventually, "I hear there's been some trouble with the family trip." "The trip was canceled," I said. "It was my decision." "I understand," he said. Elaine and I were talking, and we wondered if maybe this was a moment where the family could come together, in difficult times." "It wasn't a difficult time, Gerald. It was a clear decision." There was a pause. "Of course," he said. "I just thought, with the estate still being settled." I want to note that Robert's estate had been fully settled for 20 months. Gerald knew this. "Gerald," I said, "is there something specific you're calling to ask me?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Well," he said, "Elaine and I have been having a bit of a hard year financially speaking, and we thought, if you were reconsidering how you're spending, we wondered if perhaps there was some of Robert's savings that might, not as a handout, more like a family loan." "No," I said. "Margaret? No. I'm not offering loans from Robert's estate or my savings to family members. That money is my retirement. I earned it with Robert over 40 years of working and saving and being careful. It isn't a family fund. It was never a family fund." He tried once more gently, suggesting that Robert would have wanted the family to support each other. "Robert wanted me to be comfortable for the rest of my life," I said. "He told me that directly. Supporting me is what he arranged for. I'm going to honor that." We ended the call pleasantly. I stood in the garden for a few minutes after, looking at the irises which were overdue for dividing. Gerald's call had not surprised me. What surprised me mildly was how easy it had been to say no. I had spent so many years treating no as a last resort, something to be arrived at only after exhausting every other option, every softer refusal, every diplomatic delay. Standing in that garden, I noticed that no was simply a sentence, a short one, fully sufficient on its own. I went back inside and made a note to call my financial advisor the following week about updating the beneficiary designations on my accounts. It seemed like a timely moment to do some housekeeping. By Wednesday of that week, Renata had extended her occupation of the house in a direction I had been watching develop for some time and had decided to address. The guest room closet was full, not of Renata's weekend clothes, but of a collection of items that had accumulated over approximately 8 months of visits. 2 full suitcases, a set of shelves worth of shoes and individual dust bags, a rack of dry clean-only items in garment bags, and several boxes of what appeared to be product samples from the brand consulting work she described, but rarely seemed to actively perform. The closet was, in practical terms, no longer a guest room closet. It was Renata's personal storage unit, located in my house, operated at my square footage, subject to my property taxes, and available to her on demand. I had been meaning to address this for several months. I now addressed it. On Wednesday morning, while they were out for what had become a daily late morning outing of unclear purpose, I went into the guest room and assessed the closet. Then I brought up 3 flat-pack cardboard boxes from the garage and, over the course of about 90 minutes, carefully packed everything that belonged to Renata into those boxes. I was careful. Nothing was damaged. The garment bags were kept closed. The shoes remained in their dust bags. The boxes were taped and labeled and stacked neatly in the front hallway. The closet was then, for the first time in 8 months, an available guest room closet with a set of spare hangers and an empty shelf. They returned at around 2 in the afternoon and found the boxes. Renata's even manner did not survive this discovery. I heard her from the kitchen where I was preparing soup. I could not make out the words clearly at first, only the register. Sharp, rapid, the sound of someone who has discovered that a system they relied on has been altered without their consent. Then I heard her footsteps in the hallway, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway, and the expression on her face was the most honest thing I had seen from her in 2 years. "You pack my things," she said. "I cleared the guest room closet," I said. "The boxes are in the hallway. They're packed carefully. You went into the room and went through my things without asking me." "I went into the guest room in my house and cleared items from the closet in the guest room in my house," I said. "I didn't go through anything. I moved it. There's a difference." You can't just..." She stopped, recomposed herself. "Daniel," she called, with a quality of command that told me she had decided he was going to be useful to her now. Daniel appeared. He looked at the soup, then at Renata, then at me, then at the general area of the hallway where he now understood the boxes were. "Mom," he began. "There are 3 boxes in the hallway," I said. "They're clearly labeled and packed securely. The closet in the guest room is available to you both if you need it during your stay." "This is unbelievable, Renata said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the room. "This is genuinely unbelievable." "I imagine it feels that way," I said. She turned and went back upstairs. The quality of her departure was different from her previous exits. There was less calculation in it and more of something raw. Frustration looking for an exit and not finding one that felt adequate. Daniel looked at me for a moment. I could see something moving behind his eyes that was different from what I'd seen before. He was no longer looking for the diplomatic path. He was starting, I thought, to actually look at the situation. "Dad's card," he said quietly. I looked at him. He looked at the counter. "I've been meaning to... There's something I should tell you about the credit card." I had discovered it the previous week, which is why his hesitation now made complete sense. Robert and I had maintained a joint household account with a linked credit card, and after Robert's death, I had not immediately removed Daniel's name from the authorized user list because he had occasionally used it for household emergencies. Once for a plumbing repair when I'd been traveling. Once for a grocery run when I'd been ill. I had not monitored it carefully. In the past 6 months, I had noticed a pattern in the statements that did not correspond to anything I recognized. A hotel stay in Scottsdale, a restaurant charge in New York that I had not made, 2 separate charges from a luxury goods retailer that I did not patronize. The total was not catastrophic, but it was $4,000 and some dollars, and none of it had been mentioned to me. When I had pulled the statements and gone through them methodically, the picture had become clear. Daniel had not charged these things without awareness. He had charged them assuming I believed that I would not look closely enough to notice, or that if I noticed, I would not say anything because I had not said anything about other things. I had gone to the bank the following morning. I had removed Daniel from the authorized user list. I had changed the card number and the account password. I had set up transaction alerts for every purchase above $50. Then I had waited to see when he would mention it. "I know about the card," I said. He looked at me. His face went through something complicated. "I should have talked to you," he said. "Yes," I said. "You should have." It was Renata wanted to go to Scottsdale for her birthday, and I didn't want to tell her we couldn't afford it. I looked at my son for a long moment. He was 37 years old. He had my father's eyes and Robert's way of standing when he was ashamed of something. Weight shifted to the left, chin slightly down. "Daniel," I said, "the card has been closed. A new one was issued in my name only. The hotel in Scottsdale, the restaurant, the purchases from the retailer. I have the statements. I will not be pursuing a formal complaint. But I need you to understand that what happened there was not an oversight. It was a choice. And it matters." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." "The car," I added. He looked up. When Daniel and Renata had arrived for the week, they had come in his SUV. But there was also my car, a 7-year-old Volvo that I kept in excellent condition, which Renata had been using during the days when Daniel was on work calls and she wanted to go somewhere. She had done this before, on other visits, and I had allowed it without formally granting permission because raising it had seemed, at the time, like more friction than I wanted. Renata drove my car the way she occupied my house, as though the arrangement were self-evident and permanent. I'd put my spare key back on my keyring on Tuesday morning. "I've also moved the spare key back into my keeping," I said to Daniel. "Renata can use a rideshare or a rental if she needs to go somewhere. My car isn't part of the hospitality arrangement." He absorbed this. I watched it land on him slowly, the full picture, like a photograph developing. The refrigerator, the closet, the card, the car, the trip, the album in the trash. He was not a bad person. I want to be very clear about that because I think it matters. He was a person who had allowed things to drift because drift was comfortable, and who had told himself, as comfortable people often do, that because nothing was being said, nothing was wrong. He was arriving, at 37, at the understanding that silence is not the same as consent. "Mom," he said, and stopped. "You don't have to say anything right now," I said, "but I need you to think about what I've said." He nodded and left the kitchen. I finished the soup. They were quiet that evening. There was a tension between the two of them that had not been present before. A specific, contained tension that I recognized as the kind produced when two people who have been operating as a unit discover that the unit's operational assumptions were built on something that has now been removed. Renata was not speaking to Daniel with the same fluency she had been using. He was not deferring to her in the same automatic way. Dinner was brief and not particularly comfortable, and I found I did not need it to be comfortable. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat on the porch until dark. The following afternoon, Thursday, I was in the garden when I heard them through the open window of the guest room above. I was not listening. I was staking a peony that had grown too tall for its support cage, but their voices were raised enough that specific words arrived without my seeking them, and what I heard told me that the ground between them had been shifting for longer than this week. Renata was speaking at considerable volume about choices, about commitments, about the future she had assumed she was building and what it actually turned out to consist of. Daniel was responding in a way that was quieter but not submissive. There was a flatness to his answers that told me he was done managing the temperature of her emotions at the expense of his own clarity. I did not feel satisfied by this. I want to be precise about that. There was no pleasure in knowing that my son's marriage was under strain. There was instead a kind of sorrow, not regret, but sorrow, for the years that had led to this room, this raised voice, this particular Thursday afternoon. Things had not needed to go this way. They had gone this way because of a series of choices, none of them mine. On Friday morning, Renata came downstairs with a suitcase. She set it by the front door and then came to the kitchen, where I was having my coffee, and she looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "I'm going to stay with my sister in the city for a few days." "All right," I said. "I think it's better," she said. "I understand," I said. There was a moment where I think she may have been waiting for me to ask her to stay, or to apologize, or to offer a restoration of the old terms. I did not do any of those things. I said, travel safely. And I meant it genuinely, because whatever had happened between us, I did not wish her harm. The car that came for her was an Uber. I watched it from the kitchen window without any particular feeling, beyond the factual recognition that the house felt different the moment it pulled out of the driveway. Quieter, more genuinely itself. I stood there for a moment, noticing it. Then I poured a second cup of coffee and took it to the porch. Daniel came downstairs about an hour later. He made himself coffee without ceremony and came to sit in the other porch chair, the one that had been Robert's. He did not ask for anything. We sat for a while without speaking, which had not been something we had done in some time. It felt like something returning to its right shape after having been bent. "I owe you money," he said eventually. "Yes," I said. "We can work that out when things settle." He nodded. He looked out at the oaks. "I've been letting a lot of things happen," he said, "that I knew weren't right, because it was easier." "I know," I said. He didn't speak again for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry about the album. What you made, it was beautiful. I looked at it again last night." I had returned the album to the dining room sideboard the day after the dinner. I had not made a point of it. It was simply there, where it belonged. "Thank you," and I said. "Mom," he said, "I need to get my life in order." "I know that too," I said. We sat on the porch for another half hour. The light through the oaks was the particular slanted gold that Connecticut produces in the late morning of an early summer day, and the air was cool enough to make the warmth of the coffee notable. There was nothing triumphant about the morning. It was simply very quiet in the right way. About 2 weeks after Renata left, Daniel called me from the city. He had been back home by then for 10 days. He told me that he and Renata were in a period of figuring things out, which I understood to mean they had not yet decided what they were to each other, now that the specific gravity of the previous arrangement had been removed. He sounded steadier than I had heard him in some time. He had spoken to a financial advisor, his own, and was working on a plan. He mentioned this without prompting, which was new. He called again a week after that to ask if he could come to visit. He said it carefully, asking, not assuming, with a date in mind and a length of stay proposed, and a question at the end about whether that would work for me. I said yes. He arrived on a Saturday morning with flowers from a market, which he had not done before in his adult life, and we spent the afternoon cooking together the way Robert and I used to. Side by side at the counter, nothing complicated, nothing that required a performance. Before he left, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a check. The amount was the same number I had quietly noted from the card statements. He had not shorted it. He had not proposed a payment plan. He had simply figured it out and done it. "I know it doesn't fix everything," he said. "No," I said, "but it's the right direction." He hugged me at the door in the way he had when he was a boy, long and not immediately releasing. I held on for an appropriate moment and then let go. Some months have passed since then. The house is mine in every sense it has ever been, and in a few new ones. I had the guest room closet fitted with a proper cedar lining, which I had always wanted and never done because the closet had been occupied. I divided the irises finally and planted a new row along the garden wall where a gap had been forming for years. I began having Carol and her husband over for dinner on the second Sunday of each month, and these dinners have become something I genuinely look forward to. Easy, unhurried, full of conversation that does not require careful navigation. The commemorative album sits on the bookshelf in the living room. Several of the cousins who attended the anniversary celebration have asked for copies of the photographs from it. I am having prints made. I learned things about myself in the months I have just described that I could not have learned any other way. I learned that I had spent a great deal of my life treating my own needs as a secondary category, things to be attended to after everyone else's business had been sorted. I had done this so consistently and for so long that it had become invisible to me. It had also become invisible, in a different way, to the people around me, who had learned to see my accommodation as a feature of the environment rather than a choice I was making. The moment I stopped making it, the environment changed. The people in it were forced to reckon with something they had never had to reckon with before. The actual cost of what they had been receiving. My resources are mine. My time is mine. My house is mine. My care, when I give it, is mine to give, not a default product of my presence. These are not new ideas. They are very old ideas, stated in 1,000 ways in 1,000 languages across all of human history. The challenge is not in understanding them. The challenge is in living them out day after day against the accumulated weight of all the years when you did not. That weight is real. But so is the morning on the other side of it when you wake up in a house that is entirely yours and pour a cup of coffee and sit on a porch that faces a stand of old oak trees and feel, for perhaps the first time in a very long time, that the space around you corresponds exactly to who you are. The gift I spent 3 weeks making was never junk. It was evidence of what I value: time, care, memory, the specific, irreplaceable texture of a family's history. The person who dropped it in a trash can was telling me something about what she valued, which turned out to be something very different. I am grateful she told me clearly. It saved me a great deal of time. What I understand now, what I could not have stated with this particular certainty a year ago, is that love without dignity is not love. It is an arrangement. And the moment you begin to see it as an arrangement rather than as something genuine, you are already free to renegotiate its terms. The renegotiation is not the end of the relationship. It is the beginning of the only version of the relationship that has any chance of being real. I did not cancel that trip to punish Renata. I canceled it because I looked clearly at what was in front of me and recognized that I had been contributing to a fiction. The fiction that what was happening between us was a family relationship rather than a resource extraction. The moment I recognized the fiction, continuing to fund it became something I was simply no longer willing to do. It had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with accuracy. Your peace is not a guest room. It is not available to anyone who decides they need it. It does not come with complimentary breakfast and fresh linens on request. It is a room in the house of your own life, and only you hold the key. If this story found you at a moment when you are sitting with something similar, sir, when you're trying to decide whether what you have been accepting is acceptable, whether the cost of keeping the peace is higher than the peace itself, I hope something in what I told you has been useful. Not as a template, not as a prescription, but as evidence that one ordinary woman of 64 years with a garden and a porch and a very particular set of feelings about her kitchen managed to find her way to the other side of a long and complicated accommodation and came out with herself intact. You can do this too. You are not obligated to keep paying for something you no longer consent to give. If you have experienced something like this, I would truly love to hear about it. Leave your story in the comments below. Not because I think misery needs company, but because I know from my own experience how much it helps to discover that someone else has walked a version of the same path. We are, many of us, learning these lessons later than we might have wished. But later is not never. And here, at least, you are not alone. If these stories speak to something in your life, please stay. Subscribe so that you don't miss the ones that are still to come. There are more. There are always more. And they always end with someone finding their way back to themselves. I'll see you in the next one.